In the military camps of ancient Rome, there was a terrifyingly brutal form of collective punishment. It was the infamous decimation, since the slaughter involved one's own comrades, and was exceedingly cruel. This law only appeared 4 times in the long history of 2,500 years. According to a brief history of Rome, this punishment resulted in the execution of 4,000 soldiers, who met a tragic death under the feet of their own comrades. Just a few days ago, Tiberius led his troops to attack Spartacus, but a large number of soldiers disobeyed Tiberius's orders and retreated on their own. Their fear of Spartacus far outweighed their fear of their general. Tiberius was wounded in battle, fortunately saved by his friend Sabinus. After returning to the camp, Crassus was furious, criticizing his son for the rash attack, and decided to enforce the long-prohibited decimation on the soldiers. He wants to show the cowardly soldiers that desertion is far worse than death at the hands of the rebels. Seeing Sabinus among those to be punished, Tiberius hurriedly pleaded with his father, but what his father said next plunged Tiberius into deep despair.
I have too long considered you a child, Tiberius. Apologies. You stand a soldier now, and deserve to be treated as any other. Join your men. Fall to command.
The decimation involved grouping every 10 men together. 1 would draw a white stone, and 9 would draw black stones. The one who drew the white stone would be stoned or beaten to death by the 9 with black stones. Those who drew black stones would also lose their current status, being demoted to servants, living with slaves and prostitutes, and eating the lowest quality of food. The worst thing about this military law is that innocent people suffer too, regardless of your rank, or even if you hadn't fled. If someone in your unit had, you too would suffer the consequences. Fortunately, Tiberius drew a black stone, but when he looked towards Sabinus, he was struck dumb.
Let it be done!
At Crassus's command, the brutal collective punishment began. Watching Sabinus, who hadn't fled and had saved him, being beaten, Tiberius's heart was breaking. For a warrior, this was the most painful and undignified way to die. Unable to bear to see Sabinus suffer, Tiberius ended Sabinus' life in tears. Ultimately, this real historical event resulted in the execution of 4,000 soldiers. After that, no one in Crassus's army dared to flee again, even if it meant facing a mountain of swords and a sea of flames, or an abyssal chasm. The soldiers would grit their teeth and tearfully charge forward. Even if some soldiers thought of fleeing, they would be sternly stopped by their comrades, or even killed on the spot. As for those who did not draw the fatal lot and survived, they were ultimately demoted to servants, living alongside slaves and prostitutes. Tiberius was no exception. Sabinus' death plunged Tiberius into deep guilt. He harbored intense hatred towards his father. This caused a rift in the relationship between father and son. Crassus hoped to improve the relationship between father and son through his lover Corre, but little did he know that he was about to lose his most beloved woman completely. Kind-hearted Corre always treated Tiberius as her own child. She found Tiberius and told him, "Your father's actions were to demonstrate military discipline. His love for you exceeds anyone else's."
It appears he loves you more.
A thing far removed from truth. Apologies. You mistake intent.
No. You mistake mine. You took something from me.
To get back at his father, Tiberius eventually turns his evil hand on the woman his father loved most. Spartacus arrived at the storeroom where the prisoners' bodies were kept. It was crammed with hundreds of bodies haphazardly arranged. Strangely, Spartacus didn't plan to bury these bodies but instead instructed his men to sprinkle salt on them to delay decomposition, because he was going to use these corpses to defeat the Roman legions. Just a few days ago, Spartacus and his rebel army had captured the city. Due to a lack of food and hatred for the Romans, Crassus urged Spartacus to kill the Roman prisoners in the city. but Spartacus refused. However, while Spartacus was out, Crassus, incited by his wife Naevia, led the slave army to start a horrific massacre of the prisoners. By the time Spartacus returned, only a dozen or so Romans had survived in the entire city. Spartacus was heartbroken. While saving these dozen prisoners, Spartacus sternly warned Crassus that if anyone dared to massacre prisoners again, regardless of who they were, the only outcome would be death. This incident directly led to the breakdown of their relationship. Crassus resolved to lead half of the rebel army that followed him and completely break away from Spartacus. But at the moment, Crassus' Roman army had already sealed off all the land surrounding the city. Crassus decided to break through the blockade with combined forces and then go their separate ways from Spartacus. Spartacus had no intention of dealing with Crassus' rebellion. The looming threat of the encircling Roman army outside was the most pressing danger. After ordering his men to sprinkle salt on the bodies of the prisoners, Spartacus asked Agron to stay in the city to keep an eye on the restless Crassus. He planned to secretly set sail with Gannicus using the pirate ships. After paying a hefty sum to Heraclio, the latter left a sailor for Spartacus and stayed back in the city of Sinuessa to enjoy himself. However, Spartacus failed to notice the spy Caesar observing his every move from a distance. After Spartacus left, Caesar deliberately mentioned Spartacus' sea voyage in front of Crassus. Upon hearing this, Crassus grew even angrier, upset that the current Spartacus kept everything from him. So, Crassus, along with Naevia, furiously confronted Agron, hoping to learn Spartacus' purpose for the sea voyage. Agron fearlessly made his stance clear. He would always support Spartacus and wouldn't say anything until Spartacus returned. Spartacus went to sea because he learned from Heraclio that Crassus' supplies were being sent to Sicily. So, he took Gannicus and about a dozen others to Sicily to verify this. Upon arriving at the deserted island, they indeed found a troop of mule soldiers transporting food. Spartacus and his men swiftly slaughtered the enemy forces. When they opened the carts, they confirmed the truth of Heraclio's words. Spartacus was thrilled. This meant they had discovered the enemy's weakness. Inside the city, Naevia saw from the walls a group of Roman soldiers not far away. She encouraged Crassus to rush out of the city for a decisive battle with the Romans. As Crassus was riling up the rebels to go out and fight, Agron unapologetically stopped his reckless actions. However, at this point, the soldiers' emotions had reached a peak, making it impossible for them to easily compromise. Just as the standoff reached a peak, Spartacus finally returned through the back gate and stopped the farce.
Why are you assembled with rising intent?
To meet those of Rome gathered upon hill!
He's given order to throw open gate. I would see it opened as well.
At last he falls to fucking reason!
Oh, you mistake me. I do not give command to see Crassus' men engaged.
Then what moves purpose?
I would see what remains of our Roman guests released.
When Spartacus announced the release of all Roman prisoners, Crassus furiously accused him of losing his mind. But under Spartacus' high prestige, Crassus eventually submitted. Spartacus personally unlocked the prisoners' shackles and apologized to Leda, saying he would deal with those who had harmed them. If Crassus continued to be unruly, Spartacus would take his loyal followers to Sicily. Despite Crassus' opposition, Spartacus personally escorted Leda and the prisoners out of the city. At the city gate, there was another commotion, with Crassus and his men humiliating the prisoners. After the prisoners left safely, Crassus' anger reached its peak. He stormed into Spartacus' house, venting his anger and arguing that releasing prisoners carelessly would pose a threat to the rebels. They might have seen or heard something in the city.
Or laid eyes on...
They have laid eyes upon two brothers divided, a chasm we must bridge.
One widened by your schemes in Sicilia.
I think Crassus will believe us well when Lyta tells him of it.
You release her, so that he will know of your plans.
When he moves to halt them, we shall see the man and his legions to their end.
It was then that Spartacus revealed his carefully planned strategy. Releasing the prisoners was to send a message to Crassus, making him believe that the rebel army's two leaders had split, misleading him to think Spartacus was preparing to lead half the army to Sicily. In reality, it was a feint. Crassus' supplies were on Sicily. Upon receiving the news, Crassus would surely dispatch the majority of his forces to Sicily to salvage his own supplies. That would be their chance to strike the enemy. Spartacus instructed Crassus to lead the other half of the men out of the city from the back gate, cross the Milia Mountains, and launch a surprise attack on the enemy camp. Catching Crassus off guard, Crassus, baffled, said, "Half of our men to Sicily and our half to ambush the enemy's rear camp. This will leave the city of Sinuessa empty. Won't the cunning Crassus realize?" Spartacus confidently replied, "That's when the hundreds of salt-soaked bodies come into play. We'll dress them up and place them on the city walls and inside the city, creating the illusion that our numbers haven't diminished. My half will also return midway to join you in a pincer attack from the front and rear, and then we'll defeat them one by one. But this all hinges on us reconciling and facing the enemy together."
A lesson I long to teach.
In the evening, they began implementing the plan. The soldiers positioned the bodies on the city walls, with Agrin and a few dozen men staying behind in case of an emergency. Crassus was in charge of leading the main force out of the back gate. This large movement immediately made Caesar suspicious. He no longer needed to hide in a corner, and he drew his sword, killing Nemit's brother. Nemitz then realized Caesar was a spy. To save his own life, Nemitz told Caesar he could get him close to Spartacus. Caesar, with a slight smile, ended Nemitz's life with his sword. Meanwhile, Spartacus and Gannicus were waiting early at the docks for the pirate ships. However, the ships only arrived much later than the agreed time. More strangely, Heraclio was not his usual warm self but instead drew his weapon immediately upon meeting. Spartacus realized something was wrong, but it was already too late. Numerous Roman soldiers poured out of the ship's cabin. At the same time, Caesar emerged from the city, catching Spartacus off guard with a stab in the back. Fortunately, Gannicus reacted quickly and knocked Caesar away with a punch. Spartacus was utterly perplexed by this sudden turn of events. The scene shifted to the Roman camp earlier that afternoon. When Leda and the other dozen prisoners arrived at Crassus' camp, they immediately informed him of what they had heard. Subordinates also received information from Caesar, further confirming the decision of Spartacus and Crassus. Metellus was really fooled. He told Crassus to divide half of his troops to go to Sicily to besiege Spartacus, and the other half to attack the city directly. But the cunning Crassus was not so easily fooled. He knew pirates were always greedy, and if Spartacus could bribe them, so could he. Heraclio was more inclined to cooperate with the wealthy Crassus. Crassus' counter-strategy caught Spartacus off guard. At this moment, the rebel army was still assembling at the back gate. Spartacus and Gannicus were surrounded by enemy forces. Caesar, leading a dozen soldiers, entered the city from the back gate, planning to open the main city gate for the Roman army outside. Seeing the Roman soldiers breaking in, Agrin immediately jumped down from the city wall, leading a few men in a desperate fight with the enemy. The gladiatorial combat prowess was indeed terrifying. A few men were holding their own against a dozen or more enemies. Seeing the situation turning against him, Caesar shouted for the soldiers to quickly open the city gate. Two soldiers strained at the ropes, but just as the city gate was about to open, a gladiator wielding a huge axe cut the ropes, closing the gate again. Now, only Caesar, a Roman, was left inside the city. He picked up a nearby pitch and threw it, followed by a torch to ignite the city gate. The flames grew larger with the added fuel. Meanwhile, Spartacus and Gannicus on the dock were already unable to resist. Just when their lives were in danger, Crassus, having received the news, led the rebel army to their rescue. With the arrival of the main force, the situation quickly reversed, and they annihilated the Roman soldiers, including the treacherous Heraclio. Crassus' timely rescue mended their fractured relationship. However, before they could catch their breath, Crassus' massive army was approaching on pirate ships. It was too late for the rebels to retreat into the city, so Spartacus ordered a retreat up the mountain. Meanwhile, inside the city, Caesar had been beaten down by Agrin and others. As his life was in danger, a loud crashing sound suddenly came from outside the city gate.